Have you ever wondered what it meant to carry your punishment on your own body for the rest of your life? Welcome to Richard's History. I'm Richard, and today we step into the harsh realities of 18th century Pennsylvania and the practice of ear cropping. If you value honest, carefully researched stories from the past, please consider subscribing to join our growing community. Some images in this video are symbolic and may not match every specific detail, and I truly appreciate your understanding. I hope this journey offers you a reflective and thoughtful moment with history. In 18th century Pennsylvania, ear cropping was not simply an act of physical pain. It was a deliberate and highly visible form of public shaming. Colonial courts ordered the removal of part of a person's ear so that the punishment would remain written on the body itself. At a time when prisons were few, small, and not designed for long-term confinement, authorities relied on punishments that could be seen and remembered. The scar was meant to speak long after the court session ended. For the community, the meaning was clear. A cropped ear signaled that the individual had stood before the law and been judged guilty. The intention was not only to punish, but to mark. The body became a record, a permanent sign of wrongdoing that could not be easily hidden. In a society that valued reputation, trust, and public order, this visible mark functioned as a tool of social control. When we look back today, it is important to understand that this practice reflected the legal culture of its time. Colonial justice emphasized deterrence and public example over rehabilitation. Ear cropping was designed to warn others as much as it was to discipline the offender. Beyond the moment of punishment, the deeper consequence was what many historians describe as social death. The cropped ear functioned as a lasting mark of infamy. In a small 18th century community, where neighbors recognized one another in church, in markets, and on rural roads, such a visible scar could not be concealed. It was not simply an injury, it was a public record carried on the body. If you imagine living in that world, reputation was everything. Trust determined whether someone would extend credit, offer employment, or welcome you into their home. A person with a visibly altered ear carried constant proof of conviction. There was no practical way to erase it, no legal mechanism to restore anonymity. Every new introduction risked becoming an unspoken reminder of the past. This is why scholars use the term social death. The individual remained physically alive, yet their standing within the community was fundamentally altered. They could attend public gatherings, but not without being observed. They could seek work, but often under suspicion. The mark invited scrutiny and judgment long after the formal sentence had been completed. For audiences today in Britain, North America, Australia, or across Europe, it is important to understand that this outcome was intentional. The punishment extended beyond the courtroom. It reshaped identity and limited reintegration. In that sense, ear cropping imposed a sentence that outlasted the day of execution and followed the person for the rest of their life. Public punishment in 18th century Pennsylvania was meant to be witnessed. When a convicted person stood in the pillory before the sentence was carried out, the event was not hidden behind prison walls. Neighbors gathered, merchants paused their work, families watched. The humiliation became part of the shared memory of the town. Court records confirm that these penalties were executed in open spaces, precisely so that the community would see justice being done. For the individual, this exposure did not end when the crowd dispersed. The moment of shame was fixed in the minds of those who had been present. In smaller communities especially, people remembered each later appearance in the marketplace, at church, or along a familiar street could revive that memory. The visible scar reinforced it. Even if no one spoke openly, the knowledge lingered. Over time, the punished person could become a living warning. Authorities relied on this effect. The marked body served as a reminder of the consequences of crime, not only to the offender, but to everyone else. In that legal culture, deterrence depended on visibility. The individual's humiliation was transformed into a lesson for society. When we reflect on this today, it is important to recognize that the stigma was not accidental. It was woven into the structure of colonial justice. Public shame and lasting physical marks were intended to extend the power of the sentence far beyond the courtroom and deep into daily life. In 18th century Pennsylvania, identity was deeply rooted in community. A person was known through family ties, church membership, trade, and reputation. When someone was publicly punished and physically marked, that identity could shift dramatically. The individual might no longer be seen first as a neighbor, a craftsman, or a member of a congregation, but as a convicted offender. In practical terms, this often meant becoming an outcast within one's own town. Families sometimes faced difficult choices. Reputation carried economic and social consequences, and association with a convicted relative could affect marriage prospects, business trust, and standing within the community. While not every family severed ties, historical accounts show that distancing could occur, especially in tightly knit settlements where honor and public perception mattered greatly. Within Quaker communities, the consequences could extend even further. The Religious Society of Friends maintained disciplinary practices, including the possibility of disownment for members who violated moral or legal expectations. Disownment meant formal exclusion from the meeting and the loss of recognized membership. For someone already marked by corporal punishment, this could deepen isolation. The spiritual community that once provided guidance and support might no longer stand beside them. Losing that network had tangible effects. Religious fellowship, economic cooperation, and mutual aid were closely connected. Without them, rebuilding a stable life became far more difficult. The punishment therefore reached beyond the body. It altered social identity and could weaken the very relationships that once defined a person's place in society. One of the most severe consequences of ear cropping was economic. In 18th century Pennsylvania, employment depended heavily on personal reputation. Contracts were often informal, and trust functioned as currency. A visible scar from a criminal sentence could signal to potential employers that the individual had been convicted of theft or fraud. Whether fair or not, many masters, merchants, and farmers viewed that mark as evidence of unreliability. For someone seeking honest work, this created a serious barrier. Skilled positions, apprenticeships, and domestic service required confidence in character. A cropped ear could quietly close those doors. Even without a written blacklist, the body itself carried the history. Word of past convictions could spread easily in smaller towns and counties. As a result, some individuals were pushed toward the margins of the labor market. They might find only the most physically demanding work, temporary day labor, or poorly paid tasks that others refused. In harsher cases, limited opportunity increased the risk of returning to crime as a means of survival. Colonial legal systems often imposed escalating penalties for repeat offenses, and repeated convictions could lead to far more severe sentences. When we examine this pattern, it becomes clear that ear cropping did not end with the act itself. The economic impact could shape the rest of a person's life, reinforcing poverty and narrowing the path back into stable community life. Beyond the economic hardship and social stigma, there was another burden that followed many who had been marked by the court. It was a constant, quiet fear. In small 18th century communities, news traveled quickly. When property went missing or a barn was broken into, suspicion did not move at random. People looked first toward those whose past was already known. A visible scar from ear cropping could make someone an immediate subject of doubt, even without fresh evidence. The mark functioned as a permanent reminder of prior conviction. In a legal culture that kept records but relied heavily on local memory, the body itself became proof of a criminal past. This meant that an individual might live under a heightened level of scrutiny. Ordinary disputes could escalate more easily. An accusation, even a weak one, might carry extra weight simply because the person had been punished before. There was also the structure of the law to consider. Colonial systems often imposed harsher penalties for repeat offenses. A second or third conviction could bring significantly more severe consequences than the first. In some cases, under English-derived statutes, repeated serious crimes exposed a person to the possibility of capital punishment. Knowing this, anyone who had already been marked had reason to understand that their margin for error had narrowed. If we pause and think about that reality, the psychological strain becomes clearer. Daily life could be shaped by caution and vigilance. One misstep, one accusation, or one desperate decision might lead not just to another public punishment, but to the ultimate penalty. The fear was not abstract. It was grounded in the structure of the law and in the memory of the community. Beyond the visible scar and the social consequences, there was a quieter impact that is harder to measure but deeply important to acknowledge. Living with a permanent mark of conviction could shape a person's inner world in profound ways. In small 18th century communities, where daily life unfolded in shared public spaces, awareness of being watched could produce intense social anxiety. A simple walk to market or attendance at worship might carry the weight of remembered judgment. Historical records rarely preserve private emotions in detail, yet we can reasonably understand the pressures involved. Reputation defined opportunity. When that reputation was publicly damaged, self-perception could change as well. Some individuals may have withdrawn from public life, limiting contact in order to avoid scrutiny. Isolation, whether chosen or imposed, could deepen feelings of shame and alienation. There is also the possibility of emotional transformation over time. For some, enduring constant suspicion might foster despair. For others, repeated exclusion could harden into resentment toward the society that imposed the mark. These reactions would have varied from person to person, and it is important not to generalize beyond the evidence. Still, the structure of the punishment makes clear that it was designed to affect more than the body. When we consider this history today, we are not simply examining a legal practice. We are looking at a system that could reshape how individuals saw themselves. The sense of dignity and personal worth that modern audiences value so strongly was placed under sustained pressure in that colonial context. To fully understand ear cropping in Pennsylvania, we need to see it within its legal and religious setting. The colony drew heavily from English common law, which in the 17th and 18th centuries still permitted a range of corporal punishments. At the same time, Pennsylvania was shaped by Quaker leadership, especially in its early decades. The Religious Society of Friends promoted ideals of moral discipline, community, accountability, and order, while Quaker influence sometimes moderated the harshness seen in other colonies. It did not eliminate physical penalties from the legal code. In that colonial environment, corporal punishment was widely viewed as an effective deterrent. Public penalties were believed to reinforce moral boundaries and protect social stability. Rather than isolating offenders for long periods, the system emphasized visible consequences that would instruct the wider community. This approach reflected both inherited English practices and the practical realities of a developing colony with limited carceral infrastructure. Over time, however, attitudes began to shift. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, reform movements on both sides of the Atlantic questioned the morality and effectiveness of bodily mutilation as punishment. Pennsylvania itself became a significant center for penal reform, contributing to the development of more structured prison systems. As ideas about human dignity and rehabilitation evolved, penalties that permanently marked the body gradually fell out of favor. When we look back from our modern perspective, we can see this transition as part of a broader change in how justice was understood. The decline of bodily marking reflects a growing belief that punishment should not erase a person's capacity to re-enter society. Ear cropping was not simply a punishment. In my view, it functioned as a lifelong social sentence. It was never only about blood or physical pain. It carried public humiliation, social isolation, the loss of honest opportunity, and a fear that could follow a person every single day. When we study this history, we are really examining how justice once reshaped identity itself. The visuals in this video were created with artificial intelligence to help illustrate the atmosphere and make the story more accessible, even though they are symbolic representations. I would truly value hearing your thoughts on this chapter of history. Please share your perspective in the comments and consider subscribing to Richard's History so we can continue exploring the past together.